Hey guys. Tonight, let's all agree to put our phones down face up. Dim the lights. Lower the volume just a little more than necessary. And settle in. Because tonight we're drifting gently back through time. To a world where people had far too much free time, far too much ambition, and absolutely no chill when it came to inventing ways to hurt each other. This is not a story about fast battles or heroic last stands. This is about ancient weapons. The kind that make you pause and say, wow. They really woke up and chose violence. No jump scares. No shouting. Just a slow, drowsy tour of humanity's earliest and most unsettling creative projects. So let's begin. Right at the moment when early humans stopped throwing rocks randomly and started thinking about optimization. The first shocking thing about ancient weapons is not how advanced they were. It's how personal they were. Modern weapons let you press a button from far away and then go eat a sandwich. Ancient weapons required eye contact. Sometimes breathing on each other. Sometimes knowing the other person's name. And yet, people kept improving them. The spear, for example, looks harmless. Just a stick with ambition. But once humans figured out that fire makes wood harder, and stone can be shaped, things escalated quickly. You didn't just stab anymore. You stabbed efficiently. By the time we reached the civilizations of Mesopotamia, weapons were no longer survival tools. They were status symbols. The people of ancient Sumer were already carving scenes of organized violence into stone tablets. And yes, they were very proud of it. But the real overachievers arrived later. Let's float gently over to the Assyrians, who looked at warfare and thought, what if fear itself was the weapon? The Assyrians didn't just invent better swords and spears. They invented psychological warfare, centuries before it got a name. Their iron weapons alone were terrifying. Iron at the time was basically magic. Everyone else was still relying on bronze, which bends, chips, and politely gives up. Iron does not give up. Iron stays mad. An Assyrian sword could punch through armor that had worked just fine 5 minutes earlier. And then there were the siege weapons. Battering rams with metal heads. Mobile towers. Sloped ramps built with bureaucratic efficiency. They would roll these things up to a city wall while loudly advertising what they planned to do afterward. Which usually involved impalement. They really loved impalement. And the weapon wasn't just the blade. It was the promise of the blade. Cities surrendered just to avoid being featured in the next relief carving. Of course, this brings us to one of history's most unsettling realizations. Weapons don't need to be used to work. They just need a reputation. Now let's drift westward across the Mediterranean, where the Greeks were busy turning war into a philosophical exercise. The Greeks loved balance, symmetry, proportion, and somehow they applied that mindset to killing. The hoplite spear, the dory, was about 8 feet long. Long enough to stab someone politely from behind a shield wall. Short enough to keep things civilized. The real shock wasn't the spear itself. It was how standardized everything became. Identical shields. Identical armor. Identical training. War became less about rage and more about teamwork. Which sounds nice until you remember what the teamwork was for. But the Greeks didn't stop at spears. They also developed some truly creative ideas, especially when defending cities. And that's where we meet a man who was brilliant, sleep-deprived, and deeply uninterested in subtlety. Archimedes. Archimedes lived in Syracuse, and while he's famous for bathtubs and shouting "Eureka!", his real talent was making invading armies regret their life choices. Legend tells us he designed massive claw-like cranes that could lift enemy ships right out of the water, and then drop them, gently, from a great height. There were also mirrors. So many mirrors. Highly polished bronze mirrors that allegedly focused sunlight into death rays. Did it actually work? Probably not in the dramatic way people imagine. But imagine being a sailor and seeing a group of old men calmly adjusting mirrors while staring at you. That alone is unsettling. The Greeks understood something important. Confusion is a weapon. Now let's slide quietly into the Roman world, where subtlety officially died. The Romans didn't invent most of their weapons. They improved them. Relentlessly. The gladius, the short Roman sword, wasn't designed for flashy swings. It was designed for stabbing under shields into ribs, and then being pulled back out without getting stuck. Very thoughtful design. Roman soldiers trained to stab, not slash. Slash wounds look dramatic. Stab wounds end arguments. And then there were the siege engines. Ballistae that could fire bolts the size of fence posts. Catapults that launched stones, corpses, and occasionally whatever was nearby. But the most shocking Roman weapon wasn't mechanical. It was organizational. The Roman army itself was a weapon system. Discipline. Standardization. Logistics. They could build a fortified camp every single night. Dig trenches. Erect walls. Then pack it all up and march again in the morning. It's very hard to fight people who treat war like a boring office job. And yet, even Rome had its limits. Which brings us to something truly special. Something sticky. Something flaming. Something that absolutely refused to behave. Greek fire. Greek fire was used by the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, and it was unfair. It burned on water, in ships, in people. You could not put it out with water, which frankly feels like cheating. The exact formula is still unknown, and honestly that's probably for the best. Imagine being a medieval sailor and seeing flames crawling across the sea toward you. No explanation. No extinguisher. Just vibes. Greek fire wasn't just a weapon. It was a message. We have secrets and you don't. Now let's slow things down and head east, where ancient China was quietly inventing things centuries ahead of everyone else. Crossbows existed in China long before they became popular in Europe. And unlike bows, crossbows required less training, which meant anyone could use them. This terrified traditional warrior elites, who believed skill should matter. Ancient Chinese generals disagreed. They preferred results. A crossbow bolt doesn't care about your noble lineage. Doesn't care how long you trained. Just arrives. And then there was gunpowder. Originally intended for alchemy and immortality. 'Cause of course it was. Instead it produced explosions. And humans, upon discovering explosions, immediately abandoned immortality research and focused on fireworks and bombs. Early gunpowder weapons were unreliable, loud, and dangerous to the user, which historically has never stopped anyone. Fire lances, primitive grenades, exploding arrows. These weren't battlefield dominators yet, but they were warnings. The future had arrived. And it smelled like sulfur. Now, before we drift too far forward in time, let's pause and appreciate something important. Ancient weapons shocked the world not because they were efficient, but because they revealed how inventive humans could be. When motivated by fear, pride, or boredom, every blade, every mechanism, every horrifying improvement, they all came from someone looking at an existing weapon and saying, yes, but what if it was worse? And in the next part, we'll continue floating through history, into weapons designed not just to kill, but to terrify, humiliate, and psychologically unravel entire populations. So take a breath. Adjust your pillow. Part 2. When weapons stopped wanting to kill you quickly. Alright, welcome back. If you nodded off a little, that's perfect. That means it's working. Let's ease ourselves back into the past, where humanity decided that simply winning a fight was no longer enough. Now the goal was to linger, to intimidate, to send a message that would echo long after everyone went home and had a very quiet dinner. Because at some point ancient weapons stopped being about efficiency and started being about emotional damage. Let's begin with a group that looked at war and said, no armor, no retreat, no therapy. The Spartans. Sparta didn't invent many new weapons. They simply committed to them aggressively. The Spartan spear and shield were not shocking by themselves. What was shocking was the lifestyle built around them. Spartan boys were trained from childhood to endure pain, hunger, and humiliation, not as a phase, as a permanent personality trait. Their weapons were extensions of that philosophy. Short swords for close-range fighting. Heavy shields that protected the formation, not the individual. Drop your shield, and you weren't just a coward. You were socially dead. Spartan warfare was slow, grinding, and exhausting. No fancy maneuvers. Just two walls of humanity leaning into each other until one side collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. It was suffocating, which honestly makes it worse. But if the Spartans mastered psychological pressure through discipline, other cultures leaned into something more creative. Let's drift north into the vast grasslands of Central Asia, where mobility was everything and subtlety was optional. The Scythians. The Scythians were nomadic horse warriors who made even seasoned Greek historians uncomfortable. They were excellent archers. They fired from horseback. They could retreat while shooting. And they could do it all day. But what shocked the ancient world wasn't just their skill. It was their habits. Scythians reportedly drank the blood of their first slain enemy. They made drinking cups from skulls. They decorated their horses with human scalps. Was all of this common practice? Probably exaggerated. But that's kind of the point. Fear doesn't require accuracy. Their weapons were lightweight, curved bows with incredible range and power. Perfect for hit-and-run warfare. You couldn't catch them. You couldn't corner them. And even if you won, you were deeply unsettled afterward. Now let's float gently into a different kind of shock. One that involved rituals, symbolism, and a very specific obsession with the sun. Aztecs. Aztec Empire. The Aztecs had weapons that confused European observers. Take the macuahuitl, a wooden club lined with razor-sharp obsidian blades. It didn't stab. It didn't pierce armor easily. Instead it sliced. Accounts claim it could decapitate a horse, which may be an exaggeration, but not by much. Obsidian is sharper than steel. It fractures cleanly. And the goal wasn't always to kill. The Aztecs valued capture. Their wars weren't always about conquest. They were about taking prisoners for ritual sacrifice, which adds a deeply unsettling layer to their weapons. Imagine fighting someone who is actively trying not to kill you, because they have plans for later. Their weapons were optimized for disabling, breaking limbs, rendering you helpless. From their perspective, this was cosmic maintenance. Feed the gods. Keep the sun moving. From everyone else's perspective, it was a lot. Now let's gently slide forward into a time when warfare became fast again. Brutally fast. Enter the Mongols. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan didn't invent new weapons. He weaponized speed, coordination, and fear. Mongol composite bows were masterpieces of engineering. Made from wood, horn, and sinew. Powerful. Deadly from horseback. They could fire accurately while moving at full speed. Mongol tactics involved feigned retreats, encirclements, sudden overwhelming force. But the most shocking Mongol weapon was reputation. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Cities that surrendered were spared. Word traveled quickly. Sometimes the Mongols didn't even need to attack. The rumor did the work. They also engaged in early biological warfare. Plague victims' bodies were hurled into besieged cities. Water supplies were contaminated. It wasn't refined, but it was effective. Again, the weapon wasn't just the arrow. It was the idea of the arrow. Now let's slow things down again and talk about siege weapons. Because if ancient warfare had a patience test, this was it. Siege towers were rolling skyscrapers made of wood and iron. They allowed attackers to match the height of city walls, which must have been deeply rude. Battering rams were capped with metal and sometimes shaped like animal heads. Symbolism mattered. You weren't just breaking a gate. You were dominating it. And then there were trebuchets. The trebuchet didn't just throw rocks. Threw messages. Dead animals. Diseased corpses. Severed heads. Sometimes notes. This was warfare as slow-burn psychological pressure. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The weapon was starvation. And finally, despair. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate something quietly horrifying. Ancient weapons didn't shock people because they were loud or flashy. They shocked people because they revealed intent. Someone had to sit down, think, refine. Someone had to look at a human problem and solve it with engineering. And what's more unsettling, they often did it beautifully. Weapons were decorated, inlaid with gold, engraved with myths. They were art objects, which means someone admired them. Someone took pride in them. And that realization is perhaps the most shocking thing of all. In the next part, we'll drift further into devices designed specifically to punish, control, and quietly terrify populations, often without ever stepping onto a battlefield. So stay still. Let your breathing slow. And we'll continue. Part 3. When weapons decided to discipline society. Alright, welcome back again. If you're still awake, that's okay. If you're not, honestly, that's ideal. Let's ease ourselves into the part of history where weapons stopped being reserved for enemies and started being used on everyone else. Because at some point, ancient rulers realized something very important. You don't need to kill people constantly to stay in power. You just need them to believe you could. Any moment, while looking mildly annoyed. This is where weapons of punishment, control, and example setting quietly enter the chat. Yes, they are deeply uncomfortable, but we'll talk about them gently, like a bedtime story. A very questionable bedtime story. Let's begin in ancient China, where order was not a suggestion. Qin Dynasty. The Qin Dynasty was short-lived. Very short-lived. But wow, did they make an impression. Their founder, Qin Shi Huang, unified China through sheer administrative aggression. Standardized weights. Standardized writing. Standardized laws. And standardized punishments. Qin justice did not believe in nuance. Or mercy. Or bad days. Weapons here weren't just for war. They were tools of compliance. Polearms weren't only battlefield weapons. They were carried by guards enforcing labor, taxes, and obedience. Execution devices were designed to be public, efficient, and memorable. Not flashy. Just unavoidable. The goal wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was clarity. Break the law. This happens. Everyone understood. Everyone complied. For a while. Now let's drift west again into the Roman world, which had an extremely legalistic approach to pain. The Romans loved rules. They loved categories. They loved making sure suffering was applied correctly. Take crucifixion. Crucifixion. Crucifixion wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to occupy space. Roadsides, hills, city entrances. The cross itself wasn't the shocking part. It was how common it was. Anyone walking into a Roman city might pass dozens of bodies in various stages of dying. This was not accidental. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves, rebels, and the socially invisible. Roman citizens were exempt. Pain in Rome was political. The weapon here wasn't the wood or the nails. It was visibility. You didn't need to rebel yourself. You just had to look. Now let's soften things slightly and talk about something that sounds silly until it absolutely isn't. The man-catcher. Man-catcher. Despite the name, this was not used for polite disagreement. The man-catcher was a pole weapon with a spring-loaded, crescent-shaped jaw at the end, designed to grab a person by the neck, torso, or limbs, and hold them. Not stab, not kill, just restrain. It was often used by guards who needed to capture someone alive, or remove someone from a situation without stabbing the wrong noble. Allowed distance, control, humiliation. Imagine being gently but firmly pinned to the ground like an inconvenient insect, in front of everyone. Efficient, quiet, emotionally devastating. Now let's float towards something heavier. Literally, the ball and chain. Ball and chain. Contrary to popular belief, prisoners weren't always dragging these around dungeons. Often they were used for public labor. The weight wasn't meant to crush you, just slow you down, make escape impossible, make every movement a reminder. This wasn't about pain. It was about time. Every step was heavier than the last. Every hour longer. Weapons like this didn't shock because they were violent. They shocked because they were patient. Now let's talk about fear that moves. Animals. War elephants, to be precise. War elephants. Used in India, Persia, and later by Carthage, war elephants were living weapons. Armored, trained, loud. They could trample infantry, scatter cavalry, and terrify horses that had never seen anything so large and so angry. But elephants were unpredictable. If injured or panicked, they could turn around and crush their own side, which is not ideal. Still, the psychological impact was enormous. Imagine standing in formation and hearing the ground shake. Seeing towers strapped to animals the size of small buildings. You might survive, but you would remember it. And remembering is half the point. Now let's slow the pace again and talk about something quieter. Poison. Poison. Poison wasn't flashy. It wasn't honorable. And that's exactly why elites loved it. Poison cup. Tainted meal. A subtle application to a ring or blade. No battlefield. No witnesses. Just a sudden illness. Slow decline. Poison shocked the ancient world because it made power feel fragile. You could have guards, walls, armies, but you still had to eat. Now let's gently connect all of this together. Ancient weapons didn't just evolve to kill enemies. They evolved to shape behavior, to enforce rules, to create fear without constant action. The most effective weapon was often the one that didn't move, didn't swing, didn't fire, stood there, visible, waiting. Cross by the road, a guard with a polearm, an execution platform in the town square. They told stories without words, and everyone understood the ending. In the next part, we'll drift into the strange world of ceremonial, symbolic, and status-based weapons. Objects that existed less to be used, and more to be seen. So let your thoughts slow. Let the history blur softly at the edges. And we'll continue. Part 4. When weapons became accessories. Alright, welcome back. Still here. Still drifting. This is the part of history where weapons stop being strictly practical and start becoming statements. Because once rulers felt reasonably confident that no one was about to rush them with a pitchfork, they discovered something important. A weapon doesn't always need to be used. Sometimes it just needs to be held, or worn, or displayed dramatically in a throne room with very intentional lighting. This is where weapons become ceremonial, symbolic, occasionally absurd, and somehow, even more unsettling. Let's begin with swords. 'Cause of course we are. Across cultures, the sword became less about combat and more about identity. In Japan, this idea was taken very seriously. Right. For the samurai, the sword wasn't just a weapon. It was the soul. Specifically the katana. Forged with obsessive care. Folded steel. Precise curvature. The craftsmanship bordered on spiritual. But here's the quiet irony. By the later periods of Japanese history, many samurai rarely fought in actual battles. Peace had settled in. And yet, the swords remained. Perfectly maintained. Always nearby. The weapon became a symbol of moral authority rather than constant violence. You didn't need to draw it. Everyone already knew what it meant. Which, in a strange way, made it more powerful. Now let's drift west again into medieval Europe, where kings had an entire aesthetic built around sharp objects. Royal swords were enormous, decorated with gold, inlaid with gems, completely impractical for real combat. But that wasn't the point. These swords existed for coronations, ceremonies, and oaths. They were held upright, never swung. A king didn't need to fight. The sword said he could. And that was enough. Which brings us to one of the most famous ceremonial weapons in history. Excalibur. Excalibur was less a sword and more a resume. Proved legitimacy. Divine approval. Destiny. The story wasn't about how sharp it was. It was about who was allowed to touch it. And that's a recurring theme with symbolic weapons. Access matters more than function. Now let's talk about maces. The mace is a blunt weapon, designed to crush armor. But ceremonial maces, those were something else. Massive, ornate, often made of precious metals. They were carried by guards, officials, and royal attendants. Not to hit people, just to exist near them. The message was simple. Authority is present. If things escalated, the mace could still do its job. But mostly it didn't need to. Now let's float gently into ancient Egypt, where symbolism was basically the whole point. Ancient Egypt. Pharaohs were often depicted holding the crook and flail. These weren't battlefield weapons. They were symbols. The crook represented shepherding the people. The flail represented discipline. Together they said, I guide you, and I can also punish you. Balanced, elegant, terrifying in a very polite way. Pharaohs were rarely shown fighting personally. Their weapons were metaphysical. The gods handled the rest. Now let's talk about crowns. Crowns. Because crowns are weapons too. In a way, a crown isn't sharp. It doesn't stab. But it creates obedience instantly. You don't argue with a crown. You kneel. And many crowns incorporated weapon imagery. Spikes. Raised edges. Subtle reminders that power is not soft. Now let's drift into a slightly darker corner. Execution swords. Executioner's sword. These swords were wide, heavy, and blunt-tipped. They were not designed for combat. They were designed for one very specific task. They were often engraved. Executioners took pride in them. A clean strike was a professional standard. The sword itself became a symbol of lawful death. Orderly. Sanctioned. Which is a very calm way to frame something deeply unsettling. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Why did symbolic weapons matter so much? Because as societies grew larger, rulers couldn't personally enforce power everywhere. They needed shortcuts, visual cues. A weapon on display told a story instantly. This person has authority. This authority is backed by force. Do not test it. No blood required. And finally, let's talk about something that looks harmless but absolutely isn't. The throne. Chair. Many ancient thrones were elevated, rigid, and uncomfortable. Some even had sharp edges or narrow seats. Sitting on them for long periods was unpleasant. The throne wasn't meant for comfort. It was meant for endurance. Ruling was work. Power had weight. Even rest was controlled. And in that sense, the throne itself was a weapon. Reminder. Now, as we gently prepare to move on, here's something to hold on to. The most shocking ancient weapons weren't always used in war. They were used in daily life. Displayed, carried, worn. They shaped behavior without ever drawing blood. And in the next part, we'll drift into weapons that blurred the line between defense and cruelty. Tools designed to protect, but which often did something else entirely. So stay relaxed. Let the images soften. Part 5. When protection quietly turned into punishment. Alright, welcome back. If your thoughts are starting to drift, that's perfect. That's exactly where ancient history likes to live. Now we're entering a strange phase of weapon evolution. A phase where people insisted, very sincerely, that everything was for defense, protection, safety, order. And yet, somehow, everyone involved still suffered. Because many of history's most shocking weapons were officially designed to protect people. From enemies, from chaos, from themselves. And somehow, those always end up being the most uncomfortable ones. Let's begin with armor. Armor sounds comforting, reassuring, promises safety. Ancient armor, however, often delivered something closer to delayed panic. Bronze armor was heavy, very heavy. A full hoplite panoply could weigh more than 60 pounds. Helmet, breastplate, greaves, shield. Once it was on, stayed on. If you fell, you didn't bounce back up. You slowly remembered every life choice that led you there. Armor didn't make you invincible. It made you committed. Which meant once the fighting started, you couldn't easily retreat, run, or change your mind. Protection became obligation. Now let's move into something more subtle. Walls. Walls are defensive. That's the idea. But walls also trap. Great Wall of China. The Great Wall wasn't a single wall. It was a system. Built, rebuilt, extended, abandoned, and rebuilt again. It protected against invasions, yes. But it also controlled movement, trade, migration. Who was allowed in? Who was allowed out? Walls don't just keep enemies away. They define who belongs. And sometimes, who doesn't. Inside a wall, safety existed. But only on certain terms. Now let's drift toward something that looks very helpful at first glance. A shield. Shields are defensive tools. They block blows. They save lives. But ancient shields were also weapons. The Roman scutum, for example, wasn't just a barrier. It was used to punch, shove, to knock enemies off balance. Shield walls advanced slowly, crushing anyone who fell underneath. If you tripped, you weren't stabbed immediately. You were pressed, suffocated. Protection became pressure. Now let's talk about helmets. Helmets protected the head, which sounds ideal. But many ancient helmets limited vision and hearing. Once inside a helmet, the world narrowed. You could hear your own breathing, your heartbeat. You saw only what was directly ahead. This made soldiers dependent on formation and commands, which meant control. Protection reduced awareness. Awareness reduced independence. Now let's float into the medieval period and talk about fortified cities. Cities with moats, gates, guard towers. From the outside they look secure. From the inside, they were pressure cookers. During sieges, defensive features turned into instruments of suffering. Food shortages, disease, crowding. People were protected from the enemy, but not from hunger. Defense extended life, sometimes just long enough to make things worse. Now let's talk about something that pretended to be merciful. Blunt weapons, maces, clubs, war hammers. Blunt weapons were often justified as more humane. No slicing, no blood loss, just force. But blunt trauma causes crushed bones, internal bleeding, and prolonged pain. A sword might end a fight quickly. A mace does not. Protection from cutting turned into suffering from crushing. Now let's drift toward restraints. Restraints are not weapons officially. They are tools, and tackles, designed to prevent harm. But restraint itself is a form of force. Ancient stocks held people in public places, hands and head locked in place. Not painful at first, just uncomfortable. Hours passed, then days. Muscles cramped, joints stiffened, crowds gathered. Restraint became humiliation. And humiliation has always been a very effective weapon. Now let's talk about gates. City gates were defensive structures. But gates controlled access to food, trade, and escape. Closing a gate could save a city, or doom it. Gatekeepers held enormous power. Protection was selective. Safety was conditional. Now let's step back and breathe for a moment. Ancient weapons that shocked the world weren't always sharp or loud. Many were quiet, static, unmoving. Wall, shield, helmet, gate. They shocked people because they revealed something deeply uncomfortable. Protection and punishment are very close neighbors. The same structure that saves you can trap you. The same armor that protects you can weigh you down. The same defense that preserves order can quietly erase freedom. And in the next part, we'll drift into weapons that were designed to impress, intimidate, and overwhelm. Not through pain, but through sheer scale. So loosen your shoulders. Let the tension melt. Part 6. When bigger became the whole point. Alright, welcome back. You're doing great. History is heavy, but we're carrying it very slowly. This is the part where ancient people decided that subtlety was overrated. Where weapons stopped whispering and started looming. Because sometimes, the most effective way to shock the world isn't precision or cruelty. Kill. If something is big enough, loud enough, and tall enough, it doesn't need to move very fast. Let's begin with something that perfectly captures this mindset. Siege towers. These were not machines. They were walking buildings. Massive wooden structures on wheels. Sometimes taller than city walls. Covered in rawhide to resist fire. They moved slowly, painfully slowly, which somehow made them worse. Imagine standing on a wall, watching a tower the size of an apartment block inch toward you. No sprinting, no panic, just inevitability. Inside the tower were soldiers, protected, waiting. The tower didn't rush. It didn't need to. It knew where it was going. Now let's drift into something even larger. Stone throwing machines. Catapults and trebuchets weren't just weapons. They were public events. Cities could hear them before they saw them. The creaking of wood. The tightening of ropes. Then silence. Then impact. Trebuchets were particularly unsettling because of their rhythm. Slow reload. Long pause. You had time to think about what was coming. And sometimes what came wasn't a stone. It was a dead animal. diseased body, or something recognizably human. The scale wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Now let's float over to something that didn't move at all. Monumental weapons, statues, reliefs, colossal carvings. Nineveh. In cities like Nineveh, massive stone reliefs depicted kings towering over enemies, lions crushed beneath royal feet, enemies reduced to decoration. These weren't historical records. They were warnings. The weapon here wasn't real, but the message was, you are small. Power is not. Now let's talk about walls again, but taller. Some ancient city walls were so massive that attacking armies couldn't even see defenders at the top. The wall didn't threaten you. It ignored you, which is somehow worse. And behind those walls were towers. Signal towers. Watchtowers. They extended vision across miles. Scale turned into surveillance. If you were moving, someone was watching. Now let's drift east again. Ancient China didn't just build walls. They built systems. Beacon towers stretched across vast distances, sending smoke by day and fire by night. One invasion sighted, and the entire frontier knew. No weapon swung. No arrow fired. But an army might turn back anyway. Scale removed surprise. Now let's talk about ships. Big ships. War galleys were floating fortresses, rowed by hundreds of men. The trireme, for example, was long, narrow, and packed with oars. Trireme. Its primary weapon wasn't arrows or fire. It was mass. A bronze ram at the front, designed to punch holes in enemy ships. Naval battles weren't chaotic melees. They were slow approaches. Angles. Momentum. When a ram hit, it didn't explode. Groaned. Would split. Water entered. The ship didn't sink immediately, which gave everyone time to understand what had happened. Scale doesn't hurry. Now let's float toward animals again. But not elephants this time. Horses. Cavalry charges weren't fast blurs. They were rolling pressure waves. The sound came first. Hooves. Breathing. Metal. A wall of moving mass. Infantry lines broke not because of weapons, but because the human brain struggles with being charged by several thousand pounds of animal. Scale overwhelms instinct. Now let's talk about something very quiet again. Numbers. Ancient rulers loved large armies, not because they were efficient, but because they were visible. A massive army camped outside a city didn't need to attack, just needed to exist. Tents stretching to the horizon, fires burning at night. The weapon here was presence. You didn't need to fight. You just waited. Until the city decided it was done waiting. Now let's step back. Why did scale shock the ancient world so deeply? Because it removed hope. You can fight a man. You can outsmart a small force. But you can't argue with a wall taller than your future. Or a tower that blocks out the sun. Scale doesn't negotiate. And perhaps the most unsettling part. All of this required planning. Logistics, coordination, resources, which means entire societies agreed this was worth doing. Bigger weapons weren't accidents. They were investments. And in the next part, we'll drift into weapons that didn't rely on size or strength at all, but on timing, surprise, and the quiet art of catching people completely unprepared. So relax your jaw. Let the images fade. Part 7. When weapons learned how to be patient. Alright, welcome back. Still drifting. Still floating somewhere between history and sleep. This is the part where ancient weapons stopped relying on strength, size, or spectacle, and instead leaned into something far more unsettling. Timing. Because if there's one thing humans are bad at defending against, it's being caught slightly off guard. Not fully asleep. Not fully alert. just unready. These weapons didn't rush. They waited. And waiting, it turns out, can be devastating. Let's begin with something deceptively simple. Trap. Ancient traps weren't elaborate death machines like in adventure movies. They were quiet, functional. Pits covered with branches. Spikes at the bottom. Sometimes poisoned. You didn't see them. You didn't hear them. You just stepped, and then stopped moving forward. Traps shock people because they removed agency. There was no opponent to fight. No warning. Just the realization that the ground itself had betrayed you. Now let's drift into something more intentional. Ambush. Ambush warfare wasn't about bravery. It was about positioning. Hiding behind ridges. In forests. Along narrow passes. The most famous ancient ambush happened in a place that still makes military historians sigh heavily. Teutoburg Forest. In 9 CE, Roman legions marched into the Teutoburg Forest expecting a routine movement. They did not get one. Germanic warriors waited. Quietly. Patiently. The forest did the work. Trees limited formation. Mud slowed movement. Rain soaked equipment. When the attack came, it wasn't dramatic. It was relentless. The Romans couldn't regroup. Couldn't see. Couldn't breathe properly. The shock wasn't the violence. It was the realization that discipline meant nothing if the environment turned against you. Now let's talk about night. Night is humanity's oldest enemy. Ancient armies hated fighting in the dark. Commands were harder to hear. Formations dissolved. But some groups leaned into this discomfort. Night raids weren't about winning battles. They were about stealing sleep. Burn a camp. Kill a few guards. Disappear. No decisive engagement. Just exhaustion. After enough nights like that, people made mistakes. Fatigue became the weapon. Now let's float toward something even quieter. Poisoned water. We've mentioned poison before, but poisoning water sources was a different kind of cruelty. You didn't see the enemy. You didn't know when it happened. You just noticed people getting sick. Animals refusing to drink. Fever spreading. The weapon wasn't lethal immediately. It was confusing. And confusion spreads faster than disease. Now let's talk about timing again. Sieges weren't always about attacking walls. Sometimes they were about waiting for winter. Ancient armies knew that cold did half the work. Cut supply lines. Block roads. Let hunger and frost weaken the city. No assault required. Winter doesn't argue. Just arrives. Now let's drift into something more personal. Assassination. Assassination. Assassination wasn't about strength. It was about proximity. A trusted servant. Familiar face. Quiet moment. Daggers were favored not because they were deadly, but because they were intimate. Assassination shocked ancient societies because it made power feel temporary. You could survive wars. Sieges, rebellions, but you still had to sleep. Now let's talk about feigned weakness. Some ancient armies pretended to retreat, dropped equipment, acted disorganized. The enemy followed. Then the trap closed. This wasn't cleverness for its own sake. It exploited a very human impulse. Confidence. Nothing shocks like realizing your advantage was borrowed. Now let's slow things down again. Waiting was hard. Patience required discipline. And only organized societies could pull it off. Which means these weapons weren't just tools. They were reflections of social structure. You needed communication, trust, coordination. Everyone had to wait together. And when the moment came, move at once. That synchronization shocked observers as much as the outcome. Because chaos is expected. Coordination is not. Now let's gently connect this part to everything before it. Weapons that relied on timing didn't dominate through fear or size. They dominated through awareness. Knowing where you were, when you would pass, how tired you'd be. They didn't fight you directly. They let circumstances do the fighting. And that might be the most unsettling lesson of all. In the next part, we'll drift into the final category of ancient weapons that shocked the world. Those that changed everything permanently. Not because they were terrifying, but because once they appeared, there was no going back. So stay still. Let the past soften. And we'll continue. Part 9. When weapons quietly ended the old world. Alright, welcome back. If you're wondering whether we skipped a number, don't worry about it. History does that too. This is the part where ancient weapons stop feeling ancient. Where the line between the old world and the modern one quietly dissolves. Without a dramatic announcement. No trumpet. No final boss. Just a slow realization that things will never be the same again. Because some weapons don't just shock people. They rewrite the rules so completely that everything before them starts to feel outdated. Almost innocent. Let's begin with something small. Unimpressive. Almost disappointing at first glance. Gunpowder. Gunpowder. When gunpowder first appeared, it wasn't terrifying. Fizzled. Smoke. It misfired. Early users probably felt a bit embarrassed. It was loud, messy, and occasionally lethal to the person holding it, which historically has never stopped anyone from continuing. Originally developed in China by alchemists searching for immortality, which feels deeply ironic. Gunpowder slowly escaped the lab and wandered into warfare. First it was novelty. Fire arrows, small bombs, smoke and noise. But then someone had a thought. Very dangerous thought. What if we put this inside a tube? And just like that, the ancient world began packing its bags. Now let's talk about early firearms. Hand cannons were not elegant. They were metal tubes on sticks. They were inaccurate, slow to reload, terrifyingly unpredictable. But here's the problem. They didn't care who you were. A lifetime of sword training meant nothing. Armor meant less and less. A farmer with minimal training could now kill a knight. That single fact changed everything. Skill-based warfare began its slow, painful decline. The shock wasn't just physical. It was social. Now let's drift into something heavier. Cannons. Cannons were loud, low, and ruinously expensive. But once they arrived, walls stopped working. Centuries of defensive architecture, towers, gates, battlements, all suddenly felt optimistic. Stone cracked, walls collapsed. Cities that had felt eternal realized they were temporary. Castles went from symbols of power to very expensive targets. The psychological shock was immense. If walls couldn't protect you, what could? Now let's slow down and notice something important. Cannons didn't immediately replace old weapons. For a long time, swords, pikes, bows, and guns all existed together. Battlefields became transitional spaces. A medieval knight might ride alongside a man holding a firearm that smelled like sulfur and regret. This overlap made warfare deeply confusing. Old rules clashed with new realities. Honor met physics. And physics did not negotiate. Now let's talk about fortifications again. Star forts. Star fort. In response to cannons, engineers redesigned cities. Thick angled walls. Low profiles. Bastions. Defense adapted. But notice something. The walls got lower, not taller. This was the moment scale lost its dominance. Precision replaced height. Engineering replaced symbolism. Weapons were no longer about fear alone. They were about math. And math is very hard to argue with. Now let's drift into the human side again. Soldiers. Ancient warriors often saw themselves as individuals. Heroes. Champions. Gunpowder didn't care about identity. Armies became anonymous. Uniforms replaced personal armor. Drills replaced duels. War became procedural, efficient, and strangely quieter. Not in sound, but in meaning. The battlefield stopped being a stage. It became a system. Now let's talk about one last quiet shock. Distance. Gunpowder weapons increased the space between people. You no longer needed to see someone's face. You didn't hear their breathing. Didn't lock eyes. The emotional distance grew alongside the physical one. Violence became abstract, which made it easier to repeat. And finally, let's exhale and look backward. Ancient weapons shocked the world not just because they hurt people. They shocked the world because they revealed how humans think. Every generation looked at what came before and said, yes, but let's refine it. Sharper, bigger, faster, quieter, until eventually, refinement erased familiarity. By the time gunpowder settled in, the ancient mindset was already fading. War was no longer personal, no longer ritualized, no longer slow. And the ancient world, with its spears, shields, walls, and symbols, quietly slipped into history. No final battle, just a long, gentle ending. So if you're still awake, that's okay. If you're drifting off, even better. History has a way of looping back on itself. And when you wake up, the world will still be shaped by these weapons, even if we don't always notice them anymore. Alright, that's enough for tonight. Part 10. When the weapons stayed, and everyone else went home. Alright, welcome back one last time. If your eyes are heavy, that's perfect. This is the part where history exhales. Because even after ancient weapons shocked the world, after they rewrote rules, collapsed walls, and quietly ended entire ways of life, they didn't disappear. They stayed. Not on battlefields, not in formation, but in memory, in habit, in the way people thought about power. So let's drift slowly through what came after the shock. When the dust settled, and humanity had to live with what it had built. Let's start with something very simple. Museums. Ancient weapons eventually stopped being held by soldiers, and started being held by curators. Behind glass, under soft lighting, labels appeared. Materials. Origin stories. A sword that once decided life and death now sits politely next to a placard explaining metallurgy, which is strangely calming. Because once something is categorized, feels contained. But here's the thing. Those weapons didn't lose their power. They just changed how they used it. A spear on display still tells a story. A shield still suggests a posture. A wall ruined still defines space. Even broken, they instruct. Now let's talk about language. Ancient weapons embedded themselves into how people speak. Toe the line. Bite the bullet. Cross swords. These phrases outlived the weapons themselves, which means the weapons never fully left. They just became metaphors. And metaphors are surprisingly durable. Now let's drift into architecture again. Modern cities still echo ancient defenses. Gates, barriers, and we don't call them fortifications anymore. We call them infrastructure. But the logic is the same. Control movement, channel behavior, create visibility. Ancient weapons taught people that space matters. That lesson stuck. Now let's talk about uniforms. Ancient armor evolved into symbols of authority. Helmets into hats, shields into badges, swords into ceremonial batons. The weapon softened, but the message remained. Authority is backed by force, even if the force is implied, especially if it's implied. Now let's float into something quieter. Training. Ancient warriors trained their bodies. Modern societies train reflexes. Standing in line, following signals, obeying structures, not because of violence, but because of systems shaped by centuries of it. Weapons taught people how to organize, and organization outlasts the blade. Now let's gently revisit fear. Ancient fear was immediate. Spear, charge, a wall falling. Modern fear is abstract, distance, uncertainty, potential, but it's still fear. And it still traces its ancestry back to the first person who looked at a tool and thought, this could enforce my will. Now let's talk about the last thing ancient weapons gave us. Once humanity realized it could shape violence, it also realized it could restrain it. Rules emerged. Customs. Was. Not perfectly. Not consistently. But the idea took hold. That power should be limited. That force should be controlled. That weapons should be last resorts. Which is a very strange conclusion to arrive at. Only after inventing so many of them. And finally, let's slow all the way down. Ancient weapons shocked the world because they revealed who we were when no one stopped us. Creative, patient, uncomfortably clever. They showed what happens when fear meets intelligence. And neither one backs down. But they also showed something else. That once the shock fades, people adapt. They rebuild. They reinterpret. They turn tools of terror into lessons. And sometimes into stories meant to be told softly. At the end of the day, when the lights are low, and the world is quiet. So if you've made it this far, thank you for drifting through history with me. And if you didn't, that's okay too. Ancient weapons have waited thousands of years. They're very good at being patient. Good night.